Spider-Man No Way Home versus the Batman. It's interesting to compare the two latest superhero films. We like to compare things as humans. Why not compare these two? So let's compare Spider-Man No Way Home to the Batman. And as many of you know, I love Spider-Man No Way Home. While I thought the Batman was, it had this great potential, but ultimately I thought it was decent instead of maybe amazing. So why is that? Let's break it down. Spider-Man No Way Home versus the Batman. I'm going to break this comparison, Spider-Man No Way Home versus the Batman. I'm going to break it up into categories. So let's start with the characters. Not just the lead character, but the entire cast of characters. I do think both films are fantastic in regards to their cast of characters. I'm going to give the W to No Way Home, but it's just slight. And here's why. I do believe that every character in No Way Home is exceptional for what it is that they are embodying. Ned is fantastic. MJ is fantastic. All three Peters in this film, you could argue that they're perfect and used extraordinarily well in the film. Now, on the Batman side, Batman is very good. Catwoman is great. Penguin is fantastic. But all the other characters are probably good at best, but not quite as good as what we got with Spider-Man No Way Home. So I'm going to give the slight win for characters to Spider-Man No Way Home. Second, let's look at the plot. I think that the Batman actually has a better plot than Spider-Man No Way Home. Now, when I say the better plot, what I'm talking about is execution of events happening in what order they happen and how they happen. The Batman has a pretty good plot. It's very Seven, detective, noir, has all those elements to it. Spider-Man No Way Home's plot sets up some amazing moments, but it's maybe not as intriguing or as original as the Batman feels, at least in the world of superhero movies. So I'm going to give the edge on the plot to the Batman. Third, let's talk about the tone. Tone is going to be super subjective. People will love the tone of the Batman or will hate the tone of the Batman. It's entirely subjective. People have been saying for a long time, DC films suck because they're too dark, and Marvel films are great because, they're fun, or whatever they say, right? Like, that's a very common complaint about DC versus Marvel. I think a lot of people will probably like the lighter tone of No Way Home. It's probably a more ubiquitous tone for people to like. But a lot of people will love the gothic darkness of the Batman. So in my opinion, the tone is super subjective. Both handled the tone of their films extremely well. I don't think there's a winner here. I think it's basically a tie. Pick whichever one you like better. Either way, the films stick with that tone. Like Spider-Man No Way Home feels like an MCU film. The Batman feels like you could have picked up a comic book and just read this movie as a comic, right? Especially the comics from the 80s and some of the comics from the 90s that were really dark. Fourth, let's talk about structure. This is a very writing or storytelling-centric breakdown of these two movies. Structure, these films are kind of exact opposites when it comes to structure. If you look at the Batman has 2.5 fantastic acts. Act 1 of the Batman, fantastic. Act 2 of the Batman, fantastic. Act 3 is okay, but it suffers a little bit near the end there. Loses its way, you could say, a little bit near the end. Some people might disagree with me there, but I think the structure of the film, it tries to reach its climax, and then it kind of just does this kind of thing where it's like, oh, wait, no, we're almost to the end. Just hang in there. It's a little too long, maybe. Spider-Man No Way Home, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite of that. It sort of struggles early on. It struggles in Act 1. A little bit of the beginning of Act 2 isn't really that great. You're kind of thinking to yourself, like, where's this movie going? It's not super interesting, but I guess it kind of feels like a Spider-Man movie, so I'm good with it, but it's not great. But then once it hits its midpoint with Aunt May's death, from that point on, it's awesome. It's great. So, some movies are like that. Some movies, the way that the structure of the film works, it's better at the beginning. Some of the structures are better at the end. I said earlier, Spider-Man No Way Home is the best second half of a movie I think I've seen since Rogue One, which is phenomenal third act. So, in my opinion, Spider-Man No Way Home is up there with some other fantastic movies. So I'm going to give Spider-Man No Way Home a slight edge, because if a film starts out really well but it doesn't end really well, so here, why do we care more about the end of a film than we do about the beginning? And I'm not saying everyone needs to, but in the narrative arc, the film is working towards proving out its premise, proving out that there's a shared human experience that we're trying to live together toward. And that's why near the end of the film, because we get more and more tense as an audience, that the reward, you can imagine it this way. I heard a singer talk about this once. It's really, really good. Really, really good. The end of the film is essentially where most of the dopamine will likely be released, or most of the brain chemicals that cause us to experience pleasure, or even if it's grief near the end. What we're experiencing in the film will likely be at its most intense at the climax of the film, end of Act 2, beginning of Act 3, in that kind of range. That's when we'll be most hyped or most tense, or most, the most grief that we might be feeling is in that kind of part of the film. But the beginning of the film is really important because it has to build up to that so that the brain continues to store those chemicals, so that when it has a release of those chemicals, it's the most possible grief, or the most possible excitement, or the funniest thing that could happen. That's what you're aiming for if you're looking at a narrative arc, right? Starts here, there's lots and lots of conflict, raises up towards its climax, and then it falls off after that. We resolve the story. So we tend to think, and I think it's because of the way our brains react to these stories, that the ending is a little bit more important than the beginning of the film is. So for that reason, I'm going to give the win to Spider-Man No Way Home here. But the beginning of the Batman is amazing. The Batman is like a 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, all the way up until maybe you call it the third act. And if the film were a little bit shorter, it might have been able to deal with that a little bit better. But, it struggles there, I think. The fifth category we'll look at here is premise. Now, I think both films struggle here a little bit. No Way Home says we need to cure people in order to be heroes. We talked about that earlier in the earlier segment. Like, the premise is, it's an interesting premise to put out there, and then I'm not even sure it proves its own premise super, super well, but it does feel like we have a shared human experience by the end of the film. So I think it executes on its premise better than the premise actually is. Now, the Batman, I think, is actually the reverse of that in many ways. The Batman says we need to bring people hope as opposed to becoming the embodiment of vengeance. By the way, vengeance is like a super popular topic or premise for shows right now. So I don't know what that's about. Maybe it's because coming out of the pandemic, we're too tribal, too against one another or something. I'm not sure. But here's what I think is kind of interesting to me is that Batman's core premise feels better to me. But I think that the execution of that premise suffers a little bit. It may be misapplied. The final monologue, the final voiceover where Batman talks about becoming hope, I think is very odd. And all of a sudden it turns the movie into something that I didn't think it was building toward. And that's why it doesn't quite work for me. Spider-Man No Way Home is actually the opposite. It's the premise is I don't even know if I agree with that premise, but the way that it executes the premise actually seems like it makes sense. So the premise makes less sense, the execution makes more sense, whereas Batman, it's almost reversed. Is the premise makes more sense, but the execution makes less sense. So, and why do we care about premise? Because premise is about the shared human experience. Does this match up with how I think and feel and believe about the world? So premise is really important. So I'm going to give the slight nod here to Spider-Man No Way Home. I think it has a slightly better execution of its premise, even though I don't know that I agree with its premise as much. But that's how writing is, right? Writing is so complex that breaking down these movies is really can be difficult, The sixth category here I want to talk about is epic moments. Movies really should have epic moments, or stories should have epic moments to kind of draw us in. And each movie wins on a different type of epic moment. Again, this is very subjective. If you like one of these, pick which one you like better. But I would argue that Spider-Man No Way Home wins as it relates to emotional moments with the characters. There's quite a few of them. The fact that they bring in the other two Spider-Men into this world of the Tom Holland Spider-Man into the MCU is amazing. And some of the moments that they have together are fantastic. But the Batman definitely wins, in my opinion, as it relates to action sequences. The Batman has some beautifully filmed action sequences, from the Batmobile chase where he's chasing the Penguin to the hallway scene where he's walking through the hallway and they're firing machine guns at him. I mean, those are beautiful, amazing sequences as it pertains to action. So, you know what? To me, it's a tie. You pick one. You say which one you like better for whatever reason, and you're right. It's just how it is. And then finally, the last thing that I want to talk about is the embodiment of the character on the screen. Now, one of the things I think is really interesting is that when I grew up with comic books, Batman and Spider-Man were two of my favorites. So comparing these two films is really interesting to me because I love both these characters. And most of you probably do. A lot of us like Spider-Man. A lot of us love Batman and Spider-Man. So the question I'm asking here is, which film seems to understand its characters better? And I think, for the most part, both films excel here, except, this is where I agreed with Ben Shapiro. By the way, if you want to go back and watch that video where I broke down Ben Shapiro's review and what I agreed with him and what I don't agree with him on, this is where I agree with Ben Shapiro. When you get to the monologue at the end of the Batman, it seems to completely fall apart in terms of its understanding of who Batman is. It's weird. It's a weird monologue. I think if you change that monologue, I'd change a lot of my opinion about the film. But the monologue is very, very, very strange. And by the way, it's not that hard to change a monologue, right? Like just have Robert Pattinson come back and record a different monologue at the end. Just change a few words. You know, I think it would be much, much better if it had a different monologue at the end. But I'm giving the win here to Spider-Man No Way Home because not only does Spider-Man No Way Home understand Tom Holland's version of Spider-Man, it understands Andrew Garfield's version of Spider-Man. It understands Tobey Maguire's version of Spider-Man. It understands why Ned is important to Tom Holland's character. It understands how MJ is a core part of the MCU and about her relationship with Spider-Man. It's phenomenal. It understands Spider-Man like no other. And by the way, I want to say this on record. I think Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, which I really enjoyed, by the way, is the best Spider-Man when it comes to him bickering with his enemies and teasing them as he fights them. His lines and the way he delivers his lines, he's the best Spider-Man when it comes to that part of the Spider-Man mythos. Anyways, that's my opinion. So at the end of the day, despite the fact that I generally prefer DC movies over Marvel movies, I love both, but I tend to prefer some of the questions DC is dealing with there. I love both of them. But for today's comparison, Spider-Man No Way Home versus the Batman, I'm going to have to pick Spider-Man No Way Home as the winner. Both good films, but I think Spider-Man is a great film, so I'm going to pick that as the winner. But I want to hear what your opinion is in the comments down below. Don't just tell me that I'm an idiot. I mean, you can. That's fine with me. But also tell me why you think the Batman is better than Spider-Man. I'm always curious to hear your thoughts about why that is. Comment down below. Let me know which movie you think was the better superhero movie.